The disgrace did not arrive loudly. It arrived as certainty, as the knowledge that something precious had already been taken and would never be returned. It moved through the Duke's life like a verdict delivered without trial, leaving behind the quiet ruin that follows a public lie accepted as truth. Grief had already trained him in endurance, yet this was sharper, for it carried the scent of judgment rather than loss. In the measured world of early 19th century England, reputation was a form of inheritance, and his had been touched by a shadow he could not name aloud. He was a widower of unassailable standing, bound to a title older than memory, schooled from boyhood to master silence as other men mastered speech. The Regency court admired his restraint and relied upon it, for he did not trouble the world with confessions. What the court did not see was the loneliness that followed duty like a faithful hound, nor the weariness of a man whose private life had been folded away for the sake of public order. The Duke had learned that survival required composure, and so he lived as though composed of marble, polished and cold. The woman entered his life without ceremony, and that too was a kind of tragedy. She arrived not as a guest but as an answer to a practical need, appointed quietly to manage correspondence others mishandled or feared. Well-educated, exact in her language and careful with her opinions, she carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Society had no name for her beyond what it whispered, and whispers have a way of shrinking a person until only rumor remains. Yet she did not apologize for her presence, and the Duke noticed this first. Their initial exchanges were formal, almost bloodless, conducted in tones that respected distance. He dictated, she listened. He signed, she sealed. But within that economy of words something shifted. She understood his intent before he clarified it, corrected errors without presumption, and held confidences as though they were sacred objects. To the Duke, who had been betrayed by carelessness and ambition in equal measure, this competence felt like relief, and relief, once admitted, can become dangerous. Gossip followed swiftly, as it always does when order is disrupted. The court murmured about proximity, about impropriety implied by employment rather than action. A woman without visible protection was an invitation to speculation, and speculation thrives where facts are scarce. She endured the glances with a steadiness that suggested long practice, yet each one marked her all the same. The Duke observed these judgments from behind his reserve, aware that his silence protected him while it exposed her. The first wound was delivered in a drawing-room thick with polite cruelty. A remark, lightly phrased and meant to amuse, questioned her suitability to serve so near authority. Laughter followed, careful not to be loud. The Duke did not speak, and the room learned nothing new about him, yet everything changed. The woman lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in calculation, as though deciding how much dignity could be salvaged from the moment. The Duke felt the failure like a crack beneath his feet. Afterward, duty resumed its familiar rhythm, but the cost had been revealed. He recognized in her composure a reflection of his own, and the recognition unsettled him. He summoned her privately, intending to correct a procedural matter, yet found himself instead acknowledging the slight without naming it. His words were restrained, chosen with care, but the gesture was unmistakable. Trust was extended, not as comfort but as acknowledgement. She accepted without gratitude, and this too altered the balance between them. Gratitude would have implied charity, and charity was not what he offered. What he offered was work, responsibility, and the quiet admission that he saw her clearly. The Duke understood then that his household had become the stage for a conflict larger than either of them, one that set reputation against truth and order against conscience. As days passed, the pressure mounted, invisible yet relentless. Letters arrived bearing the weight of expectation, and she answered them with precision that shielded him from further scrutiny. He began to rely upon her judgment, and reliance deepened into something that threatened his careful isolation. He was accustomed to command, not dependence, and the shift disturbed his sense of control. The tragedy that opened this chapter of his life had not yet revealed its full design. It lingered between them, unnamed, shaping each exchange. In the silence that followed their meetings, the Duke sensed that by appointing her, he had disturbed a past he believed settled. The knowledge settled heavily, and for the first time since his widowhood, he feared not loss but revelation. That fear altered his conduct in ways subtle enough to escape notice yet profound enough to matter. He weighed each instruction, each silence, aware that power could wound as surely as it could shelter. The woman continued her work with unwavering discipline, but something in her restraint suggested vigilance, as though she too sensed the ground shifting beneath established truths. Neither spoke of the past, yet the past pressed forward, insisting upon recognition. Within the Duke's mind, memory stirred uneasily, not as recollection but as absence. There were gaps where certainty should have lived, places sealed by authority and obedience. He had been taught that forgetting was a form of loyalty, and for years he had obeyed. Now obedience felt brittle. The woman's presence did not accuse him, it simply existed, and in existing, demanded that he examine the shape of his own denials. The court sensed change. Invitations thinned, glances sharpened, alliances grew cautious. The Duke stood unmoved, yet internally the old confidence faltered. He had protected his name at great cost, and now that protection threatened to unravel. In the quiet between decisions, he understood that the true conflict had begun, and that it would not be resolved by silence alone. Tragedy returned not as memory but as momentum, a force that refused stillness and demanded reckoning. It entered the Duke's ordered days through responsibility, through decisions that could no longer be delayed without consequence. Silence, once his refuge, had begun to resemble cowardice, and he felt the weight of it press upon every instruction he gave. The household continued its duties, yet beneath routine lay an unspoken understanding that something essential had shifted beyond repair. He offered no gifts that could be mistaken for favor. Instead, he placed authority into her hands with deliberate care, entrusting her with correspondence marked confidential, matters that required judgment rather than transcription. This was his language of acknowledgement, spare and exact. She accepted the responsibility without ceremony, and in doing so, stepped fully into a role that would invite both dependence and resentment. The Duke understood that power shared is power questioned, and he chose to share it anyway. Her work revealed a mind trained in restraint and discernment. She corrected phrasing that might provoke offense, anticipated objections before they were voiced, and shaped arguments that carried weight without arrogance. Each success tightened the bond between them, not as affection but as recognition. He saw in her the discipline he had been taught to admire, and the clarity he had feared to exercise. The court noticed as well, and attention once drawn rarely remains kind. Whispers hardened into suggestion, suggestion into accusation. The woman's proximity to authority became a convenient explanation for decisions others disliked. The Duke listened without interruption, absorbing insinuation as he had absorbed loss, with an expression that revealed nothing. Yet the cost of this endurance grew clearer. His silence, once protective, now appeared complicit, and the realization unsettled him more deeply than open challenge might have done. A small act altered the course of rumor. In council, when her competence was questioned with practiced disdain, the Duke responded not with rebuke, but with affirmation. He named her judgment as his own, binding his reputation to hers without apology. The room received this declaration with careful neutrality, yet its impact was unmistakable. By aligning himself so openly, he transformed speculation into risk, and risk into scandal. The woman neither thanked him nor retreated. Instead, she continued her work with heightened precision, as though aware that any error would be magnified beyond proportion. Their conversations grew more deliberate, marked by pauses that carried meaning neither dared articulate. He began to sense the limits of propriety not as barriers but as fragile agreements, maintained only by mutual consent. The tension did not seek release, it sought endurance. It was during this period of strained equilibrium that the past began to intrude with quiet persistence. Documents long untouched surfaced during a routine review, their language formal yet unsettling in implication. Dates failed to align, signatures appeared where memory faltered, and directives bore the imprint of authority rather than truth. The Duke felt an unease he could not attribute solely to curiosity. There was intention here, and intention suggested design. He asked her to examine the records, framing the request as necessity rather than confession. She approached the task with caution, aware that history often punishes those who read too closely. As she traced the patterns of omission and emphasis, her composure shifted, not into alarm but into recognition. The Duke observed this change and understood that whatever lay concealed had begun to speak. Their discussions remained circumspect, shaped by formality that protected them both. Yet within that restraint, questions emerged that could not be answered by protocol alone. Why had certain correspondences been sealed indefinitely? Why had legal language been altered at the last moment? The Duke felt the ground of his certainty erode, replaced by a sense of complicity he could neither confirm nor deny. The court responded with renewed vigilance. Invitations became tests, conversations traps laid with courtesy. The Duke navigated these with practiced skill, but the effort exhausted him. He recognized that the structure which had preserved his standing now demanded sacrifice he was no longer willing to offer. The woman, observing this strain, adjusted her counsel accordingly, urging caution without urging retreat. What passed between them was not intimacy, but alignment, a shared commitment to truth that resisted easy definition. He began to rely upon her moral clarity as much as her intellect, and reliance, once acknowledged, altered the nature of command. The Duke understood that he was no longer merely protecting a reputation. He was approaching a reckoning that would define it. The documents multiplied, each one a fragment of a narrative deliberately obscured. Together they suggested a youthful decision overridden by power greater than conscience, a correction postponed until memory itself became uncertain. The Duke confronted his own signature on a page that denied what another quietly affirmed, and the sight unsettled him profoundly. It was proof not of error but of obedience. As the implications sharpened, the woman withdrew slightly, not from duty but from assumption. She seemed to measure her words more carefully, as though guarding against an outcome she could already foresee. The Duke sensed this withdrawal as a warning, one he could not yet interpret. He felt the approach of choice heavy and unavoidable. The tragedy that had begun as rumor now took shape as revelation in progress. Each step forward narrowed the path behind him, and retreat became impossible without surrender. In the final quiet of that day, the Duke realized that the truth he had been trained to forget was demanding recognition, and that when it emerged fully, it would bind their fates in ways neither had yet named. He did not yet know how swiftly that binding would tighten, only that delay had lost its power. The silence surrounding them felt thinner, strained by expectation and consequence alike. Somewhere between duty and resolve, he sensed the beginning of an irreversible act, one that would demand courage rather than caution, and truth rather than survival before the world demanded an answer publicly. Tragedy struck as confession, not as accident, and it demanded to be spoken aloud. The Duke felt it as a tightening within his discipline, a rupture in the habit of restraint that had governed his life for decades. Silence, once a shield, now accused him with every hour it endured. The matter could no longer be managed through delegation or distance. It required presence, and presence carried risk. He summoned her not for work but for truth, and the distinction altered the air between them. His voice remained measured, yet its purpose had changed. What he placed before her were not instructions but fragments. Sealed letters, legal phrasing revised by unseen hands, dates that contradicted official memory. He did not ask her to judge them. He asked her to witness them. In that request lay vulnerability he had never previously permitted. She listened without interruption, her composure steady yet alert. When she spoke, it was with care that bordered on reverence, as though aware that words might fracture what authority had long held intact. She acknowledged the implications without dramatizing them, naming the conflict as one between lawful appearance and buried obligation. Her restraint did not soften the truth, it sharpened it. The Duke confessed then not to a deed but to compliance. He spoke of youth constrained by command, of decisions deferred to protect stability, of obedience mistaken for virtue. He did not seek absolution, nor did he ask for sympathy. He offered his account as evidence of failure, trusting her judgment to weigh it fairly. The act of confession unsettled him more than accusation ever could. She responded with a truth of her own, delivered without accusation or plea. She revealed that knowledge had long existed beyond the Duke's awareness, preserved through discretion rather than power. The revelation did not rely on sentiment, only on documentation and testimony that had been carefully guarded. What had been hidden was not a person, but legitimacy itself, deferred by authority and sustained by silence. The Duke received this with a stillness that bordered on disbelief. The implications unfolded slowly, not as shock, but as recognition of a past that had been shaped without his consent yet sustained by his compliance. He understood that the cost of silence had not been borne by him alone, and the realization altered his sense of culpability. Responsibility, once abstract, became immediate. Their exchange remained formal, yet beneath the structure ran a current of shared resolve. She did not demand correction, nor did she counsel secrecy. Instead, she outlined the consequences with precision, naming both the legal risk and the moral necessity. Her clarity offered neither comfort nor escape, it offered direction. The Duke found in that direction a steadiness he had lost. He spoke then of fear not of scandal but of damage inflicted by delay. He acknowledged that restoration would require exposure, and that exposure would invite judgment untempered by mercy. Yet he also recognized that avoidance had become untenable. The choice before him was no longer between safety and danger, but between truth and erosion. As the conversation drew toward its end, neither pretended that resolution lay within reach. What had been revealed could not be returned to concealment, nor could it be addressed without consequence. The Duke understood that action would follow, and that when it did, it would bind their futures irrevocably. He dismissed her with courtesy unchanged, yet the dismissal felt provisional, as though the roles they inhabited were already shifting. Left alone, the Duke confronted the weight of what had passed between them. Confession had altered the shape of his authority, rendering it accountable in ways he had never anticipated. The tragedy lay not in what had been done, but in how long it had been allowed to persist. As night settled into quiet resolve, he accepted that the next step would demand public reckoning, and that once taken, there would be no retreat from the truth he had finally named. Memory pressed upon him with unfamiliar insistence, not as images but as obligations resurfacing. He reviewed the language of the documents again, recognizing how carefully legality had been used to disguise erasure. Authority had not denied truth outright, it had postponed it indefinitely, trusting time to complete the task. The Duke saw now that time had failed to cooperate, and the failure demanded response. He considered the cost to his name, to the institutions that had relied upon his discretion, and to the order he had been raised to protect. None of these considerations outweighed the burden of continuation. To persist in silence would be to endorse a lie refined by tradition, and he could no longer mistake tradition for justice. The shift within him was not dramatic, but it was decisive. When she returned the following day, their exchange was brief and deliberate. He confirmed his intention to proceed, not with haste, but with resolve. She acknowledged this decision without relief, as though aware that resolve carried its own dangers. There was respect in her response, tempered by caution born of experience. She reminded him that truth, once advanced, would resist containment. He agreed, and in doing so crossed an internal threshold. The Duke understood that his authority would be tested not by opposition, but by expectation. The court would demand explanation, and explanation would expose history long concealed. Yet the alternative, he now recognized, was a corrosion that would leave nothing intact. Responsibility required endurance of consequence. As she departed, the distance between them felt altered, neither diminished nor expanded, but clarified. They were aligned not by circumstance alone, but by commitment to an outcome neither could fully control. The tragedy that had compelled confession now propelled action, and in that momentum lay the promise of restoration or ruin. The Duke remained still, aware that the next words he spoke beyond these walls would begin the reckoning he could no longer avoid. That knowledge settled heavily, sharpening anticipation as the world waited unknowingly for his declaration. Tragedy assumed its most perilous form when it demanded witness rather than secrecy. The Duke felt this as a narrowing of time, as though the world itself had begun to lean forward, attentive and unforgiving. What had once been a private reckoning now pressed toward exposure, and exposure, he knew, would not discriminate between courage and ruin. The decision he had made no longer belonged to him alone. He prepared not with haste but with gravity, assembling language as one might assemble armor, piece by deliberate piece. Every word would be weighed, every omission examined. This was not a declaration of affection, nor even of regret, it was a statement of responsibility. The distinction mattered, for sentiment could be dismissed, but responsibility, once claimed, altered the terms of judgment. The Duke understood that his authority would be measured by his willingness to be bound by truth. She observed his preparation with composed attentiveness, offering counsel only when asked. Her guidance remained precise, stripped of excess, grounded in consequence rather than hope. She did not attempt to soften the impact of his choice, nor did she frame it as redemption. Instead, she treated it as obligation long deferred. In her restraint lay a respect that steadied him more than reassurance ever could. The court gathered its expectations long before his words were spoken. Speculation hardened into assumption, and assumption into certainty that some disruption loomed. The Duke met this anticipation with calm that bordered on severity. He neither courted sympathy nor sought absolution. His bearing signaled intention, and intention unsettled those accustomed to maneuvering within ambiguity. When he spoke, it was without ornament. He presented evidence with clarity, acknowledging the authority that had shaped earlier decisions while refusing to hide behind it. He did not deny his compliance, nor did he dilute its consequences. The past was named not as scandal but as record, and record, once established, resists erasure. The room absorbed this with a silence that signaled fracture. Reactions varied, though none were trivial. Some received the disclosure with disbelief, others with indignation masked as concern for stability. A few recognized the significance immediately and retreated into caution. The Duke accepted each response without defense, his composure unbroken. He had not come to persuade. He had come to assert truth, and truth, once asserted, demanded response on its own terms. Throughout this exposure, the woman remained absent from mention, and this omission was deliberate. The Duke did not frame his declaration as defense of another, but as correction of himself. By doing so, he shifted the narrative from intrusion to accountability. The strategy was subtle, yet its effect profound. The focus remained where it belonged, on authority confronted by its own history. In private, after the weight of his words had begun its slow descent into consequence, he addressed her directly for the first time with something approaching candor. His voice retained its formality, but beneath it lay an admission carefully restrained. He spoke not of love, but of regard earned through endurance and clarity. He acknowledged that her presence had not created the crisis, but had revealed it. She received this without visible reaction, though the acknowledgement altered something between them. Respect, once implicit, became articulated. She did not respond with emotion, nor did she deflect the significance of his words. Instead, she affirmed her commitment to what followed, aware that the path ahead would not permit retreat into anonymity. The cost of alignment had become mutual. Consequences emerged swiftly, though not decisively. Authority responded with deliberation rather than condemnation, weighing precedent against principle. The Duke remained accessible, offering no further explanation beyond what had already been given. His restraint became a statement in itself, signaling confidence not in outcome but in process. The woman, observing this, recognized the transformation underway. He no longer managed reputation, he submitted it to judgment. As scrutiny intensified, the Duke's household felt the strain of uncertainty. Alliances shifted, conversations thinned, and invitations carried subtext heavy with calculation. He navigated these changes without complaint, sustained by the knowledge that retreat would render his declaration meaningless. Each day of endurance reinforced his resolve, though it offered no promise of vindication. In the midst of this tension, he offered her a choice framed without pressure. She could withdraw, preserve what remained of her privacy, and allow the process to conclude without her further involvement. The offer was sincere, shaped by an understanding of the risk she bore. He would not fault her for choosing distance. He would, in fact, facilitate it. She declined without hesitation. Her refusal was neither defiant nor sentimental, it was grounded in principle. She stated that truth, once advanced, required continuity, and that withdrawal would suggest doubt where none existed. Her decision altered the balance between them irrevocably. It was no longer protection he extended, but partnership defined by shared consequence. The Duke accepted this with a solemnity that bordered on reverence. He recognized that her choice carried greater risk than his own, for his name afforded him a measure of resilience denied to her. In that recognition lay the unspoken acknowledgement of her courage. He did not articulate gratitude, instead he adjusted his conduct to reflect equality of stake. As the days progressed, anticipation coalesced around an impending response from authority. The Duke prepared for outcomes he could not predict, sustained by resolve rather than optimism. He understood that restoration, if it came, would not erase the damage of delay, nor would it shield him from lasting scrutiny. Yet he no longer measured success by preservation of comfort. On the eve of decision, he addressed her with a statement that carried the weight of irrevocability. He affirmed that whatever judgment followed, his course would remain unchanged. Responsibility, once claimed, would not be relinquished for convenience. The words were simple, yet their implication vast. She received them with quiet acknowledgement, aware that the moment ahead would define not only his standing, but the legacy of truth he had chosen to uphold. Tragedy completed its circuit not with collapse, but with recognition, and the weight of that recognition altered everything it touched. The Duke received the final judgment without visible reaction, though its implications settled heavily within him. Authority had spoken in the careful language of continuity, acknowledging correction without celebration, legitimacy without spectacle. What had been deferred was now restored, not loudly but irrevocably. The silence that followed was different from those that had preceded it. This one carried consequence rather than concealment. He did not permit relief to soften his conduct. Instead, he absorbed the outcome with the same discipline that had governed his disclosure, aware that restoration was not absolution. The past could be amended in record, but its effects would persist in memory and reputation alike. He accepted this without resentment. The cost of truth, once paid, does not invite negotiation. The woman received the news with composed stillness. There was no visible triumph in her expression, nor any suggestion that vindication had erased the years of restraint that had shaped her. What altered was not her demeanor, but the space she occupied within it. She was no longer peripheral to events unfolding around her. She stood within them by right rather than proximity. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable. The Duke addressed her not as subordinate nor as shielded presence, but as equal participant in what had been achieved. His words remained measured, but they carried clarity unburdened by caution. He acknowledged that restoration had been possible only because endurance had been matched by resolve, and that resolve had not been his alone. The acknowledgement did not seek response, it stood as statement. She answered with the same restraint that had characterized her throughout, affirming the outcome without personal claim upon it. Yet beneath her composure lay a quiet release, the easing of vigilance long maintained. For the first time she allowed herself to stand without calculating the cost of visibility. The moment did not announce itself, but it lingered nonetheless. The household adjusted gradually, absorbing change as it absorbed custom, through repetition rather than decree. Alliances recalibrated, some withdrawing, others advancing cautiously. The Duke observed these movements with attentiveness unmarred by anxiety. His standing had altered, but not diminished in the way detractors had predicted. Responsibility, once demonstrated, commanded a respect that reputation alone could not secure. He offered her a position no longer defined by discretion alone, but by authority publicly recognized. The offer was framed plainly, stripped of sentiment, and accompanied by assurance rather than insistence. He would accept refusal without protest. Choice, he understood, was essential to dignity. Without it, restoration would remain incomplete. She considered the offer with deliberation that reflected both prudence and self-knowledge. Acceptance would bind her future to a world that had not been kind, yet departure would suggest retreat from a truth she had helped advance. Her response balanced these considerations without apology. She accepted, not as concession, but as continuation of a responsibility she had already assumed. Their association thus transformed, no longer shielded by anonymity nor endangered by implication. What passed between them was not intimacy in the conventional sense, but alignment refined by trial. The Duke recognized that affection, if it were to exist at all, would emerge from this alignment rather than precede it. He did not press beyond what had been offered freely. Public acknowledgement followed, restrained yet definitive. The record was corrected, titles clarified, and obligations reaffirmed. The process lacked ceremony, but its effect was profound. What had been questioned now stood affirmed, not through indulgence but through procedure. The Duke observed this with the detachment of one who understands that justice often arrives without pageantry. In private, he reflected upon the transformation wrought not by impulse, but by endurance. His life, once governed by avoidance, now bore the imprint of deliberate engagement. The woman's presence within it symbolized this shift, not as reward but as reminder. She embodied the cost of silence and the necessity of speech, held in careful balance. He spoke to her then with a candor he had not previously permitted himself. His words did not promise comfort nor invoke future ease. Instead, he articulated commitment grounded in consequence, acknowledging that whatever lay ahead would require the same resolve that had brought them thus far. The statement was neither declaration nor request. It was invitation extended without expectation. She received this with composed attentiveness, understanding the significance without dramatizing it. Her reply was measured, affirming regard without surrendering autonomy. She acknowledged the possibility of shared future while preserving the integrity of present choice. In this restraint lay trust more durable than assurance. The world beyond their immediate sphere continued its rhythms, largely indifferent to the moral shifts that had occurred within it. Yet within the Duke's life, something fundamental had changed. Authority no longer rested solely upon inheritance, but upon accountability willingly embraced. The knowledge steadied him, offering a clarity he had long lacked. As time advanced, the consequences of his decision revealed themselves incrementally. Some doors closed, others opened unexpectedly. The Duke navigated these developments with attentiveness sharpened by experience. He no longer mistook acceptance for virtue, nor silence for stability. The lesson, hard-won, informed every subsequent choice. The woman, now established in her role, exercised authority with the same precision that had marked her earlier discretion. Her conduct reflected an understanding of power not as entitlement, but as stewardship. The Duke observed this with respect untainted by possessiveness. Their partnership, defined by shared principle, resisted easy categorization. In the quiet intervals between obligation and expectation, the Duke considered the meaning of restoration. It had not returned him to what he had been, nor erased the cost of delay. Instead, it had altered his trajectory, aligning it more closely with conscience than convenience. He recognized this as gain, though it carried no illusion of ease. On the final evening before a new season of public engagement began, he stood alone, aware that the next chapter would be shaped by the choices already made. The tragedy that had once threatened erasure had instead compelled definition. He did not know whether the world would ultimately remember his actions with approval or disdain. What he knew was that silence no longer governed him, and that the truth he had chosen to uphold would continue to demand vigilance, resolve, and courage as the future unfolded.